Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this public event on the mass deprivation of citizenship rights in Europe in 2018 without the citizens' consent. This is very, very important. In the previous session of ECIT, we are talking about democracy and active citizenship. But the issue of democracy, when we're talking about the shrinking of the EU citizenry, has not been debated significantly. So we have to redress this deficit and to talk about democracy and the democratic deficit in Europe and the mass deprivation of citizenship rights without the individual's consent, or if we would like to use Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the tyranny of the majority, or the tyranny of a slim majority that deprives a numerical minority of the rights tonight. So we are grateful to Mr. Venables for organizing this event. Yes. And the distinguished panel that we have tonight. And let me introduce the panelists. On my left, Mr. Andrew Duff, who is known for his work with the Federal Trust in the UK for years. And he's an expert on treaty reforms and the president of the Spinelli Group.
And an ex-MEP.
Yes, absolutely.
You were going to come on to that.
Absolutely. Mr. Simpson, who is the reason for our presence here, the author of a European Citizens Initiative on the retention of EU citizenship. Mrs. Julie Ward, MEP, who had a wonderful intervention earlier on during the last panel. And finally, Mr. Stephen Houghton from the Netherlands, who is going to talk about strategic litigation and the references to the European Court of Justice, which have been made and probably would be made at some point in the future. My name is Dora Kostakopoulou, and I have been working on citizenship and migration for the last 30 years. And our panelists are going to have about 10 minutes each to introduce the various issues, and we'll start with Mr. Simpson and the European Citizens Initiative. So without any further ado, Mr. Simpson, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, and good evening. In the beginning was the deed, somebody once told me. And if you look at your phone, you can see the European Citizens Initiative, permanent EU citizenship it's called. And when I last had access, we had 79,822 endorsements. So I hope during the course of this evening's meeting that we might actually cross the 80,000 threshold, which is quite a long way short of 1 million, but rather more than the 24,000 we got at our first attempt at a European Citizens Initiative. We did one that began in May 2017, which was called Retaining European Citizenship. And we got 24,000 endorsements in the course of 12 months, quite modest. There were 2 other initiatives that were on the question of citizenship, and altogether the 3 of us, we got around 60,000 endorsements. This year, we seem to have hit a different kind of situation because, first of all, we had the pleasant surprise that the College of Commissioners decided to register the initiative. There was some doubt in our minds that that would happen, but it was registered. Then we had to wait 4 or 5 weeks for the online collection system to kick in. And although we'd had quite a flurry of publicity at the beginning, we thought that this hiatus might have dissipated support, but it worked the other way around, I think. And as soon as the online collection system commenced, there was a wave of endorsements. And I think we got 20 or 30,000 very quickly. They tend to be 3 for the UK for everyone outside of the UK. But even that's rather encouraging because we got fewer than 2,000 from the EU27 on the first ECI, and we've got getting on for 20,000 after a couple of weeks on the new one. What's going on? You know, in part, it must be a story that people are concerned about the prospect of losing a status, which many people realised all along that it was an important status, but new people are coming to realise that it's a status that confers a lot of opportunities. But we deliberately pitched the permanent European Union citizenship initiative with a view to trying to sound a warning that there's a risk entailed in European Union citizenship. And in doing so, we're echoing the words of Jane Golding, the chairwoman of British in Europe, who spoke to the European Parliament last November, I think it was. It was very clear. I mean, she said, I have a little expression here. She was saying that she was asking them not to disappoint them, not to disappoint us now, she was saying. That we've made our life decisions on the basis of European Union citizenship, and now it's being taken away from us. What will future generations think? You know, there is a downgrading, there is a regression, in effect. And I think that's the vein that we're tapping into, in part. I think that there's an alertness now that citizenship is rather more than just a list of rights to do with voting in elections or not being able to vote in elections, and freedom of movement, and help from consular representation. I mean, they're all significant things, but actually those of us that are engaged in the project of a peaceful Europe believe that a European citizenship is actually the way to buttress that peaceful Europe. We operate on a fairly modest basis. There are three of us primarily who are spending a good part of our time on this. We have a little organising committee of 7. You're required to have European Union citizens resident in 7 member states. Our contacts, some of them come from the peace movement in the 1980s, people that we were working with on European nuclear disarmament. And it was really quite a buzz today to meet Miklos Barabás from Hungary, who was also engaged in that work long before the Berlin Wall came down. So that we have a kind of a historic commitment to the European project. One of the key developments, I think, this year is that via Twitter, a lot of activists in various member states have taken it upon themselves simply to spread the initiative. And they'll put their own gloss on it. So Sibyl in Germany has said that she describes herself as German plus European, and when she shared the initiative, she said, I just supported this. All EU countries should join the UK in calling for a permanent and inalienable EU citizenship. Well, it's not just the UK that's doing that. I mean, this is a trans-European project. Tamara in Warsaw simply said vote. And I think that's quite an important point because this is an enactment of democratic opportunity. We have in the UK currently the campaign for a people's vote, which is very much directed at the circus at Westminster, which has really been quite surprising, actually, in its twists and turns, and rather very disappointing thus far. But we remain to see what happens in the finale. But we see this citizens' vote at the European level as complementary to the campaign for a people's vote in the United Kingdom. What are we looking for? In particular, we want support networks in member states, self-starting support networks that take their own initiatives. I mean, we have very clear targets. In Belgium, we want 15,750 endorsements, please. That's the minimum threshold. At the moment, we have 1,200, well, we have 1,300 or thereabouts, I think. About 8% of the minimum threshold. In Ireland, we want 8,250 endorsements, please. A rather more modest target, and we have 877 so far, which is over 8% of the minimum threshold. In Luxembourg, where the threshold is 4,500, we have around 300 endorsements. But we'd like another 4,200, please. And who's going to organise that? I mean, these a volunteer. Thank you. Yes, yes. But these are very clear targets. There are other countries that are interested in this campaign. Miklos was talking to me earlier about Hungary and how the threshold there is 15,750. Can we perhaps accomplish that? That would be a blow for freedom, I think. Interestingly, Romania already has more than 10% of its minimum threshold. We don't know why. We don't know who's done this, but it's got 2,500 endorsements. It may be to do with the Romanian community in the United Kingdom, but it may also be to do with political developments in Romania. I mean, the historic role of the European Union has been to buttress democracy in all sorts of places. And I think that's a role that endures for the Union. So where do we find those support networks? I hope that amongst this audience this evening, some of you might actually start those networks. Thank you very much.
So initially we had EU citizenship, and then the discussion was how can we possibly make EU citizenship relevant? How could we possibly enhance direct democracy in Europe? And the proposal for the Citizens' Initiative was circulated and adopted. Now we have an EU Citizens' Initiative to support EU citizenship. An act of citizenship for EU citizenship.
Yes.
Mr. Stephen.
Okay, thank you. Do you mind if I stand up here, because I've brought some legal notes with me. Having seen a barrister on Tuesday night, I have to be prepared for this. Oh dear, it doesn't actually stand up, never mind. Does that work?
Yes.
Okay, all right then, very good. All right then. Just a short introduction to myself. My name is Stephen Heighton. I've lived and worked in the Netherlands for now 25 years. And as of this morning, I officially applied for my Dutch passport and paid my €866. Given the queues before the door because of the Dutch immigration, I have to wait 10 months before I will actually get my Dutch passport. The authorities are completely overwhelmed with applications at the moment. Not surprisingly, quite a few from the UK. So I've done that this morning, and so for me, it's a whole new chapter in my life and that of my family, and obviously it's quite a serious decision. And if you've never been confronted with that decision where you are changing what is your historical family background, it's also quite an emotional one, which people, should we say, if you've come from further east or places where there are serious problems around the world, then you do it because you know it's the right thing for your family. But when you're in a West European country, perhaps that's something we've not had to experience since the outset, since the conclusion of the Second World War. So for a lot of Brits, it's a big step. Tony asked me to come down and fill you in on where we were with the legal case in the Netherlands, which some of you may or may not be aware of. So if you're not aware of it, that's new. If you are aware, I apologise for going back over a bit of news, but at least it will bring you up to date about what's going on. because I've got some, as they say, fresh news, which is only something that started this week. First of all, I'd just like to say a big thank you to Nick Nugent, who I actually didn't know. Nick, would you like to just stand up, please?
Yeah.
Nick is the chairman of the British Society in Amsterdam as one of the fellow plaintiffs. A bit weird, actually, you know, in life. Not many things you go through in life. If you're a lawyer, you understand this. But you go to the court and you see a big board in the building, and in the court building it says, plaintiffs, S. Heighton, Nick Nugent, versus the state of the Netherlands. Quite impressive, actually, you know, when you see that. And I also said versus the city of Amsterdam. They were a bit miffed by it, but it was just for practical reasons that they were included. So, short synopsis about what went on, where we're up to. Okay, so the original court case was before the district court in Amsterdam and concerned the question about whether citizens of the UK residing in the Netherlands will lose their fundamental freedoms derived from the UK's membership of the EU, and as set out in Article 20, of which there's been lots and lots of discussions due to the fact that the UK is leaving the EU. Now, as plaintiffs, we argued that we have made use of our fundamental freedoms to reside and work in another EU member state. We stated specifically that we not only fear that those rights and freedoms will be harmed in the event of Brexit, but that we are already suffering harm from the uncertainty of our legal position in that case. The threat of harm, we argued, exists because the December 17 progress report stated that negotiating states are currently operating on the assumption that the existing rights and freedoms of British residents in other EU countries will cease if the negotiating parties don't agree the deal. That's actually where we are. So before the district court in Amsterdam, we argued that European law might well guarantee continued EU citizenship rights to UK citizens. The judge agreed. He said, in his opinion, that there was sufficient uncertainty about the interpretation of Article 20 for the matter to be referred to the ECJ. Now, since there are lots of barristers in the room here, or legal experts, I'm not going to go into the niceties of Article 20 about where it's blank and where it's not blank, etc. I assume you all know that. However, I thought you might like to know about what his key points in the decision, because he made a judgment on a number of points. Firstly, he said that the European Court of Justice has repeatedly ruled on the doctrine of acquired rights. Its jurisprudence can be summarised as follows. In principle, acquired rights cannot be withdrawn by subsequent decisions. This follows on from the specifically general legal principles which form the basis of EU law, such as the principle of legal certainty and the principle of protection of legitimate expectations. The ECJ also broadly interpreted both EU and citizenship and the resulting rights. While Article 20 states that citizenship of the Union comes alongside national citizenship, the ECJ has ruled that citizenship of the Union should be primary status of nationals of the EU member states, and on that basis, subject to specific legal exceptions. And they are entitled to equal treatment under the law. Now, I don't understand that paragraph, but that's what the lawyer told me to say. So, just so if you don't do, okay. So then he also said the ECJ has ruled that once lawfully acquired, EU citizenship is an independent source of rights and obligations that cannot simply be reduced or affected by national government action. They are, as I understand it, facts. Now, those of you who are experts can correct me, but that's what I'm told, because that's what was in the ruling by the court in Amsterdam. Interestingly, his ruling included the following. Some of you with a longer memory may remember this, but he says Brexit resembled the termination of international treaties covered by the by the 1969 Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. And in that it says, amongst other things, this treaty contains the clause on the establishment and interpretation of fulfilment and termination of treaties. If matters progress to the termination of a treaty, it says, under Article 70 of the Vienna Treaty, it stipulates the legal consequences of stipulates what the legal consequences of termination are. The parties are released from their obligation to implement the treaty, but that termination does not affect any obligation whatsoever or any legal position whatsoever of the parties which arose due to the treaty prior to its termination. In other words, if you have accrued rights prior to the treaty, then when you terminate the treaty, you can't negate those rights by that termination. That was one of the cornerstones of his ruling. Amusingly, I understand, these treaties were largely drafted by UK lawyers to prevent the oppression of citizens by a government. His judgment also addressed several other issues, including minority rights, those of children, etc., which I'm not going to discuss here. If you want to know more, I have an English translation. I can certainly furnish you with a full English translation of the case if you'd like to let me know afterwards. So far, so good. So we won round one. However, the Dutch government appealed to the Dutch appeal court. This was a very complicated legal hearing, and whilst my Dutch is okay to get my inburgers exam, as they call it, it's not good enough after 3 hours of listening to Dutch argument. It can get a bit difficult. Basically, the cornerstone of the discussion, whether in the first place there should even be an appeal, that was our argument, because in theory, to protect the ECJ, the European law says that if a referral is made to the ECJ, it can't be appealed against. That's set out in the treaties. I should say here that the reason why this court case went in the Netherlands and not other European countries is because the Netherlands has a slightly different legal system. In most European countries, in order to get to the ECJ, you've got to go up the system all the way to the top first. So you've got to exhaust all the process to the Supreme Court, whatever the Supreme Court is, before you can go across to the European Court. That, of course, means if you're funding it yourself, it's a very expensive exercise, and it's a very good way of preventing cases getting to the ECJ, unless you've got a lot of finance behind you, or you're a big company, or you're a government, or whatever. So for private citizens, it's a very hard exercise. The Dutch, however, have a slightly different approach. Being very practical, they're not very keen on spending a lot of money sending cases up the line if it's going to end up going across the line anyway. So basically what the Dutch allow you to do at the lowest court is to go to the ECJ where there is a question of interpretation of European treaties. You can automatically go across with a question to the judges, 3. So that is the reason why the court case started in the Netherlands. And I was one of 5 plaintiffs, including Nick, that was asked to participate, all due to particular personal circumstances where it was felt that we would have a case to be heard. So in the end, we agreed, after a lot of argument, 3 hours of it, that despite the fact that our view was the court case shouldn't actually even be held, in order to make progress, we agreed the court case could be heard by the appeal court, and if they ruled in our favour, then they could decide on the questions to go to the ECJ. The European Court, and perhaps this hasn't made the headlines, in its judgment, agreed with the district court. It said there is sufficient reasonable doubt on the interpretation of Article 20, which implies that the loss of EU citizen will automatically lead to the loss of rights and freedoms derived therefrom, at least insofar as the right of freedom of movement and residence are concerned. So the critical points that the first court ruling was based upon, the Court of Appeal agreed with. However, the Court of Appeal considered that in this case should not be referred to the ECJ as the claims of the appellants, myself, Nick, etc., were insufficiently concrete. According to the Court of Appeals, it is unclear what the claimants expected the state of the Netherlands to actually do to protect their rights. Very, very nice, fine line of legal argument, and of course, those of us involved in the case will argue that there was a certain amount of leaning on the Court of Appeal behind the scenes, but that's the way you're always going to argue because there's no evidence. But nevertheless, that is the ruling. At the time this appeal was heard and the ruling came, our Dutch lawyers, the advice from our Dutch lawyers about whether we should appeal to the Supreme Court was that we'd be better off waiting until the effects were known and then again ask the district court for reference to the ECJ. The problem with that route is it's a bit like waiting, you're waiting for the bridge to fall down and then saying, well, it's fallen down, we could have told you it's fallen down, but it's too late because it's fallen down. That's the sort of trick. I'm sure we can all think of very good practical examples of where after the event doesn't help you resolve the event before the event. So that was the situation immediately after the court case. And of course, we've had the summer, so everybody's been on holiday, so things have been a bit quiet. And until this week, this has been their view. But as of Tuesday, they are now considering an alternative plan, and I had a meeting with them on Tuesday in advance of coming to here today to advise you what they want to do. They have invested a huge amount of time and effort, most of which has been pro bono work, some of which has been funded by the crowdfunding, which maybe some of you participated in, which covered off some of the costs for the appeal, but most of it has been their own effort. And they're a bit reluctant to just let it all go because they put so much effort in, and certainly because the Court of Appeal said, we actually agree with all the core principles that were set out in the basic hearing, only we don't think you've got enough evidence to demonstrate what you might call clear and present loss. So what they want to do is to return to the district court, to the same judge who, by the way, was a Supreme Court judge in the Netherlands, and in doing so they wish to present him with a new case which is something along the lines of the following. Dear Judge, the court has ruled in favour of your view that there are questions to be put to the ECJ, but allowed the appeal on the grounds that the plaintiff's claims were not concrete. So what the legal team are now looking for, hence part of the reason I'm here, is to appeal to you because they're looking now for citizens who have been affected by Brexit in the present. So let's say, for example, and I see a lawyer from Amsterdam here, you've gone to see the lawyer from Amsterdam here, and you say, I've just lost my job because my employer says you're a Brit and I can't employ you after March 2019. That's an example of clear and present loss. So there are plenty more such examples, and there are other potential situations where you are currently resident in my case in the Netherlands, and let's say because of your business situation you've got jobs in several other European countries, which means you're on the payroll of several other European countries and not simply getting a fee. That's a bit of a difference, because then you're technically speaking on the payroll physically within the country and paying taxes in that country. That can mean that you've got a clear and present loss. So the question or the request I've got from the lawyers is, if you can think of, or you can pass the message on, or you can help in some way or other, then please get in touch with me afterwards, because we would love to hear from you. Is that a good summary? All right, and thank you very much. Thank you.
And thank you for being so optimistic as well. So we can still believe in strategic litigation. Thank you. And now Mr. Duff is going to comment on the treaties.
Well, I'm going to try to explain where I think we are with the Article 50 process and all that. We are close to an agreement on the to a conclusion of the withdrawal agreement, and the clause, the provisions that are included in that affect people, persons, individuals, citizens, are published. They're not perfect, but they try to continue as privileges through the transition period, things that we now enjoy as Brits in the EU as citizens. So a great effort has been made, supported very strongly in the Parliament, but also, I would say, in the Barnier team itself, to ensure that citizens are dealt with decently through the withdrawal experience. We're not quite there yet. There are some things to be clarified and polished, but we're closer than we have ever been. If there is no agreement, it is not going to be because there is no agreement on this matter. So it's all very well turning rights into privileges, but of course privileges granted can be privileges which can be taken away. So it is actually an intolerable position for people in the longer term. It would be nice to say that the British were so admired and trusted for their observance of the rule of law and their scrupulous attention to implementing EU law across the long years that we've been a member state, that we would be confident that this position as created in the withdrawal agreement could continue for all time. But I'm a skeptic. We don't know what will happen to the United Kingdom. In fact, nobody can know what will happen to the United Kingdom, either in the short, medium or long term. And it seems to me that it is essential that the association agreement, which will begin to be negotiated the instant we have left the European Union, contains a strong chapter on citizenship. The template that will be deployed for this negotiation is the association agreement with the Ukraine that was agreed in 2014. That's quite useful. It's very long. It's 4,854 pages. So I'm not expecting you all to have read it, but I have. And I'm pleased to say that it is a comprehensive treaty that includes a chapter on the rights of Ukrainians as they approach the convergence effort that is explicit too, in the association agreement. But even that isn't enough, especially because of the acquired rights ethos that has affected the development of the corpus of European law on these matters across the decades. So I think what we need is to make certain that in the negotiation of this association agreement, there is installed a fresh concept of associate citizenship, and that will comprise the privileges that we are going to have, that we now have as rights, that will be privileges, in respect to things like franchise, to consular protection, but also to expand the concept so that an associate citizen in the penumbra of the EU, out of the federal core, is going to be granted the right to, for instance, sign up to the ECIs and to petition the institutions of the European Union. It will be a breakthrough if we can create and then install such a concept. It will strengthen the experience of the rule of law, the sharing of the values and principles which form the EU experience, the project of Europe, in countries that are not as yet, or that continue to be member states. And in the long run, and we're speaking here of the long run, ladies and gentlemen, the experience of enjoying the rights of associate citizenship through this agreement, which will be reached between the United Kingdom and the EU, could be replicated, copied by certain other third countries, like Norway, like Ukraine. And in order, so that the Brexit experience, painful and perverse as it is, actually does begin to have, begins to trigger a more substantial improvement to the European experience than at present a lot of people expect. And so those outside the EU can express a political yearning to be inside, so that Brexit becomes part of the solution, that it begins to contribute afresh to the to European unity, as opposed to at present, where it is seen, sadly, as a huge blow to that concept. Now, I'm going to close, but as we approach the mandate of the EU 27 for the crafting of this association agreement, there will be a political declaration. This is obligatory, it's not a luxury. It must be accompanying the withdrawal agreement. And the purpose of this thing is to spell out the framework for the future relations with the EU and the United Kingdom. I have argued that it is that this thing, if we can achieve it, will be politically binding and will have the force of a soft law. That's a position which is contested by a lot of people, including people who know nothing. And there are plenty of, especially British commentators, who are preparing to dismiss the political declaration as a lot of blah blah. It ain't. It'll be in effect the first draft of the mandate that the European Council will have to design for the Commission to open up negotiations on the association agreement. It will be meant to commit the 27 to a course of action with respect to the United Kingdom. And with respect to the United Kingdom, which it'll be an agreement, it'll be a declaration of 27 plus 1, if you understand that concept. And that doesn't mean 28, actually, oddly, but it means, you know. With respect to the UK, this political declaration will try to bind not only the present Prime Minister, but also because we fear, or we feel, we suspect indeed, that Mrs. May is not going to be the Prime Minister who will conclude this negotiation of the association agreement. That this political declaration is of the utmost importance to try to bind the Brits into the same direction, the same landing place as the EU 27. And if we include in that an attractive concept of associate citizenship, it ought to make it more attractive to the Brits. In the next number of weeks, we haven't got long, a lot of work is going to be done on this political declaration, and through my own offices and through those of the Spinelli Group, which is the Federalist Intergroup in the European Parliament, and through other sources, we're doing what we can to achieve this rather innovative and controversial outcome.
Let me clarify a very simple point. The 2014 association agreement with Ukraine did not include the concept of associate citizenship.
No, but there's a chapter that speaks of the mobility of Ukrainians to come to the European Union and in reverse. So it's building into that chapter this idea.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for the clarification. Mrs. Ward, the floor is yours.
Well, I'm not a legal expert, and I think Andrew's years as an MEP are were far more long than mine. So I was elected in 2014, and I didn't work in politics before. I'm somebody who wanted to defend the social Europe that I believe is possible, the Europe of peace, the Europe of a union of peoples. I've been learning very fast ever since I was rather unexpectedly selected and elected. I represent the northwest of England. It's a huge region. I'm a Labour Party MEP. And so my work before, some people know this, sorry, I'm not going to do the whole story, but I worked in culture, theatre, arts, using culture as a tool for social change. So working really closely with grassroots organisations, with civil society. That's kind of still how I'm doing things. So throughout, from the beginning of my mandate, I'm engaging with a whole range of different civil society organisations. And many things have changed since the night of the referendum. So the nature of those civil society organisations has changed, and their mission has changed, many of them. Okay? And there are many new NGOs and civil society organisations that have been established as a result of the referendum. So I don't need to tell you all of them. Many people will be involved in some or other of them. Some are European, some are based in the UK, some are regional, some are focused on one issue, some are focused on many issues. And we're engaging with people from those organisations and directly with those organisations, trying to support them in many ways. So I'll just use the example of New Europeans. So I've been working with Roger and New Europeans. The idea of civil liberties and human rights is really, really important. We, in the European Parliament, we fight for human rights of people in countries, despotic countries around the world. We didn't think we were going to be having to fight for our human rights, but we are. So the work with New Europeans has been to try and put this idea of rights, citizenship rights, centre stage. And we've established a citizens' friendship group within the European Parliament, so that it's not just New Europeans speaking to British MEPs, but building relationships with MEPs from other countries so that they realise that this is an issue they have to engage with. They can't just say, well, it's something that's happening to the UK and, I'm not going to engage with it. So it's just, if you like, that's just one example. The other thing that happened overnight on the night of the referendum is that my email inbox completely changed. Okay, the casework we had previously been getting was about a very wide range of issues, that went from I've got a house in Spain and the builder hasn't finished it, to I want to make a film and I'm looking for European partners. It was a massive kind of range of issues that my caseworkers were dealing with. And I have to say that since the referendum, the issue has mainly been people writing to me about the anxiety and the distress that they feel because of what Brexit has done, what the referendum has done to them, to their family, to their friends, to their sense of themselves and their identity. There's people with very concrete, there are people with very concrete problems, all kinds of problems and issues that nobody had ever thought about. Complicated family relationships, business relationships, maybe having a property somewhere and not somewhere else, maybe in the middle even of doing something that, was then arrested. I recently re-met an old friend of mine who, he's a writer, he's a freelance writer, and he's a bit of a geek, and he's an expert on transport systems, particularly transport maps. And he had got a publishing deal in Paris to have the work that he'd been writing in the UK, and straight after the referendum, the deal was cancelled. They went, not interested now. He was living in London. He'd been working as a freelance reporter, journalist. This is an important story for the press club. He'd been working as a freelance journalist, being able to make a living and live in London. And he couldn't even live in London anymore. He ended up having to go, and he moved back to Ashton-under-Lyne, which those of you who know the Northwest will know it's one of the poorest parts of Manchester. He was telling me how he had to make decisions about whether or not he would turn the heating on or whether he'd feed himself. He started eating salads because he couldn't afford to heat his dinner, okay? This is a reality of Brexit, even for successful people. So there's a whole range of issues that we're dealing with. There are also people who write to me simply to tell me that I'm a traitor, I'm filth, because right from day one, I need to tell you now that I refuse to say the words, I respect the result. Okay? It's very important for me. Right. I am careful to say that I don't disrespect the people who voted out, because people didn't know what they were voting for. But I didn't respect the enactment of poor democracy. As far as I'm concerned, it was really poor quality democracy. Hitler came to power, didn't he, through a democratic process? And we have to question the very nature of the Parliamentary Act, which narrowed the franchise so much that the main three groups of people who are going to be impacted by it were shut out of the process. Young people. Now, if you're young in the UK and you lived in Scotland in the previous September and you were 16 or 17 years old, you could vote in the referendum about whether or not Scotland stayed part of the United Kingdom. And if you were that same young person, only a few months later, the following June, you were not allowed to vote in the referendum as to whether or not you retained your European citizenship. And I find that appalling democracy. So I'm willing to call it out. Well, exactly. Yeah. Yes, which is why I don't respect it, Joshua. So neither do I respect, another narrowing of the franchise is the fact that the EU 27 citizens living, working in the UK, paying into the tax economy, okay, not allowed to vote about their futures, and of course the British citizens living in the EU 27, whose lives have been made completely destabilized. So my position from the start has been that I could not say those words. I could not write those words. And it's an odd... the way it happened is I came back to the Parliament the following Monday after the referendum, and a member of my staff had kind of drafted a statement for me to send to the Labour Party members in the Northwest and to put on my website. And he'd actually written, I respect the result. And I said, I can't say it, all right? It's a lie. I don't respect it, and I'm going to spend my time now working with people who feel like me, who feel disenfranchised, who feel angry, who feel upset, whose lives are being who are suffering mental health problems, stress, anxiety, all the terrible things that have happened to people. So I kind of need to say that to you, okay? Because it puts you into I write a lot of newsletters and emails to Labour members directly, and some of them, a small proportion I have to say, because the majority of Labour Party members are pro-European, and they're also feeling terrible pain about what is happening. But there are a small number of people who write back to me in the most horrific terms. It's like medieval language, isn't it? Chop her head off because she's a traitor. But so that's a weird kind of situation for me to be in, I suppose. So we're dealing with the casework by listening to people, listening in terms of sending back very compassionate responses, taking these cases, trying to join people up with other people, having meetings with people, trying to support their causes. So I support all causes where people feel that Brexit for them is a threat, okay? I'm not partisan about it. Any organisation who is trying to do something. And there's a lot of people who are experienced campaigners. And I have to say, Roger was an MP. Roger knows about politics, okay? But there are people who have set up organisations who were never activists or political before, who were never campaigners, who were never even a secretary in a school club. And these people are setting up organisations and doing things, and it's extraordinary. And I just want to pay tribute to some of those people who found themselves at the sharp end and who've gone, I will not stand by and let this happen to my community. And their communities now are transnational communities as well as very local communities. So I'm supporting a wide range of initiatives. That means I'm here, there, and everywhere. I think I endorsed your letter in the Guardian. I'm signing so many letters I can't remember them anymore. But I'm signing the letter that went into the Guardian for this initiative, but also signing other letters as well, and being very public about my position. So I'll just say something about what's happening in my region right now, which is that Theresa May decided they would have a little pilot, a trial of settled status. And it's happening in Liverpool, and it's happening largely with students and health workers within the NHS. So it's being rolled out in Liverpool as we speak. And we all have some qualms about this, some concerns about this, some worries about this. But I suppose the fact that this is happening is potentially a step in the right direction. Nobody's saying that this is what we've been asking for, which is unilateral guarantees. But perhaps the acknowledgement that the government has to do something about the many people whose lives feel totally in the balance. It is, there's an attempt here, I think, at trying to do something. We are very worried, however, that people have to pay for this. It's not something they had to pay for before, and this will put some people off. Some people cannot navigate, they don't have easy access to websites. And I think if you have one of these phones, it wasn't working, all right? Yeah, it wasn't working. You could only do it on an Android, all right? So immediately, lots of people are disenfranchised again. They're not able to participate. There are barriers there are barriers for them to do it. We're also very concerned in the Northwest about the hostile environment that Theresa May has been so proud of. She has created a climate in the UK where anybody who is other feels unwelcome. So many people are leaving. And many people fear for their status in one way or another. And many people have been on the receiving end of the most terrible xenophobia and feel that maybe they don't want to be here anymore, even if settled status is on offer. So, and some of the people that I'm working with currently in some of the organisations, in fact, so this isn't an EU issue, but I think it's relevant. So asylum seekers coming from other countries are being encouraged to attend workshops in community venues such as churches, such as community halls, to encourage them to voluntary return to their own countries. Many of these people are people who fled in the first place because their lives were in danger. And this is the kind of environment we live in. And this voluntary returns programme, which has been happening in a number of different cities and towns across the UK, has put pressure on community organisations who haven't got money anymore because of austerity, so they're going to be paid by the Home Office to run these surgeries and give people advice. And of course they're saying yes, because it's income, it means they can pay their rent. We've been taking issue with the Home Office about this because it puts undue pressure on people who are already vulnerable. Now apparently, if you want to make a voluntary return, all you have to do, and the people who are asylum seekers know this because they've told me, all you have to do is pick up the phone and you get straight through, right? Straight through. You want to go home? Right, here's 2,000 quid, okay? You don't need a community surgery to encourage you to make a voluntary return, right? But if you want to stay, right, it's a 0800 number, it's an automated system, it's a press this button, it's a maybe you can have an interview, it's a long, complex, internecine process about, you know, which many people give up on, and they then become illegal, they don't have rights. And what happened in the lead up to Christmas, which is really, really worrying, is that genuine EU nationals who were living in the UK, who were homeless, went through a similar system in that homelessness charities were asked by the Home Office to help them deport these people back to their home countries. And this was actually not, I mean, they were legally in the UK, but community organisations working with homeless people were drawn into this government programme to get these people out of the UK, because the Conservative government has made a promise, a commitment to reduce net migration. So they're interested in getting the numbers down any way they can. So I don't trust, I mean, I'm Labour, I wouldn't trust the Tories. I don't trust what they're doing. I think that the climate in the UK that Theresa May has created is absolutely appalling and is shameful. The fact that people can present now with such anxiety about their lives, not just if they're black,
to the referendum, their parents stopped them from playing outside. Stopped them because of the level of racism and anti-Gypsyism. Now we know that the Roma community are the most discriminated against minority in the EU. But for children not to exercise their right to play freely in the streets because of the racism which was stirred up by the referendum, again, there's another shameful thing that's happened to the country. So I've been working really closely with the Roma community to be a person who listens, to give them a sense of representation,
And I do lots with the Roma here, so I work with the Roma Education Network, and I've also been working with Roma on issues around the Roma genocide and Holocaust, and everything that I do with the Roma across the EU in my work in the Parliament and with civil society groups. I email back and I send them photos, I send them pictures, I let them know what I am doing for the Roma community across Europe in a transnational way. So maybe I finish there. There might be some questions, okay? No, one thing. Politicians are always going to say one more thing. So just that thing about democracy. And I'm listening and speaking with all these groups, and I support everything that they're doing. But I'm fighting Brexit. I'm fighting it on the basis of what I've already told you, which is that, as far as I'm concerned, it was poor democracy. And Joshua is talking to me about the fact that it wasn't democracy at all. So, and I'm working alongside another Europe doing that. So, which means we're kind of progressive left against Brexit. Okay, I need to state my political position here. But there are many, back home, in case you're not following what's happened, there's a groundswell of people demanding now to have a say on the final deal. And that movement is gathering speed, is gaining momentum. 250,000 people on the People's Vote March in June, and People's Vote groups setting up all over the place. I know it's flawed. I know it's another danger. It's difficult to know what the question might be. Do we want another referendum? But it looks to me like the politicians can't sort it out.
Thank you very much. A very passionate defense for another Europe is possible, and also for highlighting the impact of otherness, constructing otherness, or making divided communities the ideal. Whilst we have the values of the EU, to TU, defending liberty and the rights of minorities and non-discrimination and democracy and the rule of law, but making lack of cohesion an idea, because they're talking about social cohesion. I'm sure there are many discussions, and this is a brainstorming session. It was designed to be a brainstorming session, so please feel free to introduce yourselves and to comment, observe, present ideas, and exchange your points of view. So we have 1, 2, let us accumulate, 3, 4, okay, the very first 4 questions. So, Sarah.
I'd like to very much applaud, especially what Julie said. I was thinking the whole time about Julie's critique of the referendum as a poor exercise in democracy, and I was thinking a lot. My name is Jeremy Gierbach, by the way. I'm an immigration lawyer in Amsterdam, but I'm also a legal scholar interested in EU citizenship. And it reminded me of a doctrine of citizenship, which has played a role in the case law of the European Court of Justice called virtual representation, or representation reinforcement, which holds that citizenship is a counterweight to the will of the so-called majority. It's a means of providing representation to unrepresented minorities. EU citizenship in its classic form provides representation to mobile EU citizens who aren't allowed to vote in their host member state. So it's a backstop to the legislatures of member states being able to make laws against it, allows judges to strike down laws that discriminate against them. And EU citizenship has also been developed in the case law of the court to provide more representation to minorities among the nationals of a member state as well. If you are born and one of your parents is an undocumented immigrant, for instance, now your parent is protected from deportation based on your EU citizenship. It's a very exciting field of development of EU law. And that's what's really a shame about the referendum, is that in one fell swoop, with the so-called democratic vote, an entire layer of protection was completely stripped away. Democracy in which the interests of the minority is not really democracy.
Tony?
Yes, I think it's because of what we've been hearing from the EU was really positive that in the appeal in the Netherlands, the emphasis was put on minorities. I think that really somehow backs up what Julie was saying. That's really the test of a true citizenship. Ability to protect minorities is very, very important. I want to follow what he said in the sense that I think even if the referendum can be defended on a number of counts, I mean, turnout was very good. One can argue that, okay, citizenship wasn't mentioned, that EU citizens in the UK couldn't vote, that people like me couldn't vote because I'd been outside the UK forever. Even if it was flawed, one can still argue that even if one accepts somehow that that was the decision, from my reading, I'm not a lawyer, but from my reading looking at European law, but particularly at international law and what happens when territories change, that the powers, the government has to lean back really in a big way, quite impressively, I think, to accommodate the citizenship of people affected by that decision. And that brings me to my question to Andrew Duff, because I think, Andrew is so much more aware than most of us on constitutional processes, and you've underlined the importance of the political declaration, and I think that strikes a strong chord with us. We can see you're right on that, absolutely. But there's a barrier to cross, and I think you must be aware of that. That for events like this, the Brexit task force refuses to come, point blank. It is not it's not in our mandate. I invited them on the grounds that it's part of the picture to say, okay, to what extent the draft withdrawal agreement is a mitigating factor in terms of loss of citizenship. And their reply is, we can't speculate about that, that's not part of our mandate. So before you would get to associate citizenship going into a political declaration on withdrawal, how do you cross the barrier which has been put up by the Article 50 negotiating team to any discussion on citizenship? And I've been very firmly told, if you want to discuss that, go to the UK government. And I said, that's not a civilized response. That's not a civilized response because we're talking here about citizenship. It's a difficult concept, very difficult concept, but it's something which should be looked at quite calmly between the UK, the EU negotiating people, and look at the European Parliament. The European Parliament is quite clear in its resolutions that they're watching the Dutch case. They see that there's something here, but there is a blockage here, and the blockage lies with the people who really hold the power. So I would like some advice about how we unblock the blockage.
Thank you. Yes.
Well, I wanted to thank Tony. I didn't know about this meeting, and I got to know Tony through his ECI. And I thought of, my name's Silver, Joshua Silver. I'm a nut and bolt physicist from Oxford, and I like to think I support democracy. And when I saw the vote on the 23rd of June, I asked a question. The question was, can anyone take away my EU citizenship and rights? So So what I actually did was I asked a bunch of lawyers, and every lawyer told me no. So I wrote a letter to Mr. Barnett, and on the 28th of July I wrote to him and I said, "Dear Mr. Barnett, as I understand it, Mr. Jean-Claude Juncker, who this email is copied, has just asked you to handle discussions about matters may arise following the 23rd of June referendum in the UK. Purpose of my letter is to let you know that it is my understanding on the basis of the legal advice I have received that no one has the power to remove from me my EU citizenship or any of the rights which flow from that, and that the same is true for my wife, Mrs. Cindy Silver, and indeed for any and all other UK citizens. I am therefore writing to you, with a copy to Mr. Juncker, to ask you to confirm to me in writing that my understanding is correct. I might add that my own analysis of the situation leads me to believe that, following the vote on the 23rd of June, there are currently at the very least 19 million voting-age UK citizens who, like me, most certainly wish to continue to be full EU citizens, and who will be prepared to take whatever action may be necessary to ensure that their EU citizenship does not change as a result of the vote. And I went on to explain that millions of people have been disenfranchised. I do have a receipt, because I emailed it and I also sent it to registered post, and I haven't got a reply. But what I have done, and this is how I got to know Tony, I asked the European Parliament to put up a sign-up list for every UK citizen who wanted to keep their EU, and it was all very difficult and they couldn't do it. It was too bureaucratic. So I created my own site, which is, the site is eucitizenship.org.uk. Made it live 4 or 5 months ago, and we now have around about 40,000 odd people have signed saying we want to keep our citizenship. And I actually noted, I sent a record of the site to Guy Verhofstadt, and he wrote back to me, and he said, the question of retaining your citizenship is still on the table. And that was an email from him on the 3rd of May. So maybe people know that.
Okay. Thank you for sharing this with us.
Well, come and sign up. eucitizenship.org.uk.
I just have a question for Julie Ward. I was, well, of course, very impassioned defense of your points of view, very admirable. I have no absolute outsider to this debate, but I'm so curious. Are there any instances of constituents within the constituency you represent, experiences with you or like-minded colleagues in the European Parliament or in the House of Commons, of minorities who voted for Brexit, and then you have to sort of represent both, right? And how do you grapple with that? How do you respond to their concerns, with whatever they may be?
Excellent, thank you. And the fifth question before.
Yeah, I have a question and a comment to Stephen, actually, because I didn't understand precisely why your lawyer said that